What if I told you that what's coming isn't just another recession, but something far deeper, something that could reshape how we live, work, and retire? Most people think in terms of ups and downs, boom, bust, recovery, but history shows that sometimes the cycle breaks. What's ahead may not be a short-term downturn, but a long-term transformation. And the real question isn't just whether we'll get through it, it's how prepared we'll be when the world changes in ways most people can't yet imagine. When most of us hear the word recession, we picture something familiar, maybe like what happened in the early 2000s or even 2008. Companies lay off workers, the stock market drops, housing prices fall, and then after a year or two, things bounce back. It's painful, but it's temporary. Like a bad storm that passes through your neighborhood, you board up the windows, wait it out, and then start cleaning up. But what I'm seeing now, what many economists and historians are quietly discussing, isn't that kind of storm. It's more like climate change, a fundamental shift in the underlying systems that govern how our economy works. And just like climate change, by the time most people recognize what's happening, the transformation is already well underway. Think about your grandparents' generation for a moment. They lived through the Great Depression, and that wasn't just a recession. It was a complete reorganization of how money, work, and society functioned. The world that emerged in the 1,940 seconds and 50 seconds was fundamentally different from the world of the 1,920 seconds. New institutions, new relationships between government and citizens, new ways of thinking about security and prosperity. That's the kind of change we might be facing now. Not just a temporary downturn, but a rewiring of the global economic system. And it's being driven by forces that are much bigger than any single country's policies or any particular industry's problems. To understand what makes this different, we first need to step back and see the bigger forces shaping the global economy. And the first of these forces is something that touches every aspect of our financial lives, yet remains invisible to most of us until it's too late. Imagine your household budget, but scaled up to the size of entire nations. For decades now, really since the 1,980 seconds, countries, companies, and families have been living increasingly on borrowed money. Now, borrowing isn't necessarily bad. When you took out a mortgage to buy your home, that debt probably made sense. You traded monthly payments for the security of ownership, and over time, your home likely increased in value. The same principle works for countries and businesses. When you borrow money to build a factory or improve infrastructure, that debt can pay for itself by increasing productivity and economic growth. It's like borrowing money to go to college. The debt is worth it if your increased earning power more than covers the cost. But here's where things get interesting and a bit scary. Over the past 4 decades, we've built an entire global economy on the assumption that debt can keep growing forever, as long as it grows a little slower than the economy itself. It's like a family that keeps taking out bigger mortgages because their house keeps getting more valuable. It works great until it doesn't. And right now, we're approaching that until it doesn't moment. I was reading about a conversation that happened back in 1971. A young clerk was working on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange when President Nixon announced that America would no longer exchange gold for dollars. This young man thought it was going to be a disaster. He expected the stock market to crash. Instead, it soared. Why? Because when you make money easier to create, things priced in that money tend to go up. That was the beginning of what economists call the debt supercycle. For over 50 years, whenever the economy hit trouble, the solution was the same: make borrowing cheaper and easier. Lower interest rates, print more money, encourage more debt. And it worked until the debt became so large that it started consuming more and more of our income just to service it. Think about this in terms you can relate to. The United States government now spends around $1 trillion every year just paying interest on money it's already borrowed. That's money that can't be spent on roads, schools, healthcare, or Social Security. It's like a family that's paying so much on credit card interest that they can't afford groceries. And it gets worse. Every year, the government has to borrow more money. That's the position many countries find themselves in today. And it's not just governments. Corporations have done the same thing. For years, they've borrowed money at incredibly low interest rates to buy back their own stock, pay dividends, and fund expansion. But now that interest rates are rising, those loans are becoming much more expensive to maintain. And then there are ordinary families, mortgage debt, credit card debt, student loans, car payments. The average household is carrying more debt relative to their income than at almost any time in history. For many retirees, this is especially concerning because you're living on fixed incomes while the cost of everything else keeps rising. But debt is only one piece of the puzzle. The second force comes from something we all feel every day: the cost of living. You've probably noticed it everywhere. Prices for basic necessities have been rising faster than they have in decades. And this isn't the kind of temporary price spike we sometimes see during economic disruptions. This feels different, more persistent, more structural. Traditional economic thinking says that recessions cure inflation. When people lose jobs and cut back on spending, demand falls, and prices should come down. It's like a pressure valve that releases steam from an overheated system. But what we're experiencing now might not respond to that traditional cure. Here's why this is particularly challenging for those of you who are retired or approaching retirement. Inflation is like a hidden tax on savings. Every year that prices rise faster than your investment returns, you're effectively getting poorer. That nest egg you've been carefully building for decades starts shrinking in real terms, even if the numbers on your account statements look the same. And it's not just about having less spending power. Inflation forces you to change how you live. Maybe you start buying generic brands instead of the products you prefer. Maybe you put off that trip to see your grandchildren. Maybe you delay necessary home repairs or medical procedures. These aren't just financial adjustments, they're life adjustments that can affect your health, your relationships, and your sense of security. The cruel irony is that the very policies designed to help the economy lower interest rates and increase government spending can make inflation worse. It's like trying to cool down a room by turning up the heat. The good intentions are there, but the mechanism doesn't work. And while money loses value, global power dynamics are shifting, making this even harder to predict. For most of our adult lives, the world has operated under what we might call the American system. The dollar was the world's primary currency. American companies dominated global markets, and American consumers drove worldwide demand. It wasn't perfect, but it was predictable. That system is breaking down, and what's replacing it is much more complex and uncertain. Think about the supply chain disruptions we experienced during the pandemic. Suddenly, products made halfway around the world couldn't reach American shelves. Medicines manufactured in China were unavailable in American pharmacies. Computer chips made in Taiwan couldn't reach American factories. We realized how dependent we'd become on a global system that we thought was stable but was actually quite fragile. Now, countries are deliberately restructuring those supply chains. They're bringing production closer to home, even if it costs more. They're forming new trade partnerships that don't include the United States. They're creating alternative systems for international payments that bypass the dollar. This isn't necessarily bad for America in the long run, but it is disruptive in the short run. And disruption creates uncertainty, and uncertainty makes it harder for businesses to plan, for investors to allocate capital, and for families to make financial decisions. For seniors especially, this matters because you tend to prefer stability and predictability. You've done your planning based on certain assumptions about how the world works, but if those assumptions are changing, your plans might need to change too. Together, debt, inflation, and geopolitics create turbulence. But there's another force that magnifies them all: technology. I've spent most of my career working with technology, and I can tell you that what's happening now is unlike anything we've seen before. We're not just talking about faster computers or better smartphones. We're talking about artificial intelligence that can perform tasks we thought only humans could do, automation that's moving from factories to offices, and digital systems that are reshaping entire industries. Now, technology has always eliminated some jobs while creating others. When automobiles replaced horses, blacksmiths became mechanics. When computers replaced typewriters, secretaries became administrative assistants with new digital skills. The pattern has been consistent: short-term disruption, followed by adaptation and new opportunities. But this time feels different in both pace and scope. Artificial intelligence isn't just replacing manual labor, it's starting to replace cognitive work. Legal research, financial analysis, medical diagnosis, even creative writing tasks that require years of education and experience are being automated. And the pace is accelerating. Unlike previous technological revolutions that unfolded over decades, AI capabilities are improving exponentially. What takes a skilled professional hours to do today might take an AI system minutes to do next year. For those of you who are already retired, this might seem like someone else's problem, but it affects you too. in ways that might not be immediately obvious. Your children and grandchildren are navigating job markets that are increasingly uncertain. The companies whose stocks are in your retirement portfolio are having to completely reinvent themselves. The healthcare system you depend on is being transformed by new technologies that promise better outcomes, but also create new complexities and costs. And these disruptions don't happen in a vacuum. They affect real lives, communities, and generations differently. When I think about the human impact of what's coming, I think about three groups of people, each facing different challenges, but all connected by the same underlying forces. First, there are seniors and retirees people, like many of you watching this. You spent decades building financial security, and now you're seeing it eroded by forces largely beyond your control. Healthcare costs that keep rising faster than your income, investment portfolios that seem to lose value just as you need them most, pension systems that promise less and deliver even less than they promise. But it's not just about money, it's about autonomy and dignity. When inflation eats away at your purchasing power, you lose some control over your own life. When technology changes how basic services work, you can feel left behind in a world that's moving too fast. When economic disruption affects your adult children, you worry about their future and wonder if you'll be able to help them. Then there are working-age adults, your children, perhaps, who are trying to build the same kind of security you managed to create, but in a much more challenging environment. They're dealing with job markets that seem increasingly unstable, housing costs that seem impossibly high, and debt burdens that you never had to carry at their age. And finally, there are younger people, your grandchildren, maybe who are coming of age, in a world where the traditional paths to prosperity seem blocked or uncertain. College costs more, but guarantees less. Home ownership feels out of reach. Starting a family requires financial resources that seem harder and harder to accumulate. What connects all these challenges is that they're not temporary setbacks that will fix themselves if we just wait long enough. They're symptoms of deeper changes in how our economic system works. And that means the solutions can't be temporary either. If we stop here, it might sound like doom and gloom, but history shows that even in times of upheaval, opportunity exists for those who adapt. And I've been studying historical cycles for years, and there's something fascinating about how human beings respond to periods of great change. We tend to think that the way things are now is the way they've always been, and the way they'll always be. But if you look back over the centuries, you see that what we consider normal is actually quite temporary. Take the period your parents or grandparents lived through. The 1,930 seconds were devastating. Unemployment reached 25%, banks failed, people lost their homes and their life savings. It seemed like the end of the world. But what emerged from that crisis was the most prosperous period in American history. The GI Bill, Social Security, the interstate highway system, the space program innovations that created opportunities your grandparents couldn't have imagined. Or consider the 1,970 seconds, a time that in many ways resembles what we're facing now. Inflation was running in double digits, energy costs were soaring, American confidence was shaken by war and political scandal, people talked about national decline, about the end of American prosperity. What did the people who not just survived but thrived during these periods have in common? They didn't waste time waiting for things to go back to the way they used to be. They looked ahead, adapted their skills, diversified their resources, and most importantly, they maintained their belief that human ingenuity and resilience could overcome any challenge. I think about the stories my grandmother used to tell about the Depression. Her family lost their farm, but instead of giving up, they moved to the city, where my grandfather learned new skills and eventually started a small business. It wasn't the life they had planned, but it was a good life, and the lessons they learned about frugality, adaptability, and community support served them well for the rest of their lives. The same pattern repeats throughout history. Economic disruption forces people to become more resourceful, more collaborative, more innovative. It strips away assumptions and forces fresh thinking. And while that process can be uncomfortable, it often leads to solutions that are better than what came before. So, what might adaptation look like today in a world facing challenges beyond a normal recession? Let me start with something personal, because I think the most important changes always begin with individual choices. And the first choice is about how we think about learning and growth. For most of human history, education was something that happened when you were young, and then you applied what you learned for the rest of your working life. But that model doesn't work anymore when knowledge becomes obsolete every few years and new technologies emerge constantly. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. I'm 70 years old. I'm not going back to school. And you're right, you probably don't need to earn another degree. But staying curious, staying engaged with new ideas, learning enough about new technologies to understand how they might affect your life, that's not just intellectually stimulating, it's practically essential. Think about online banking, telemedicine, digital communication with family members. 20 years ago, these were exotic technologies. Today, they're basic tools for maintaining independence and connection. The seniors who learn to use them have more options and more control over their lives than those who resisted. The same principle applies to understanding the economic changes we've been discussing. You don't need to become an expert on monetary policy or artificial intelligence. But understanding the basics, how inflation affects your purchasing power, how debt cycles work, how technological change creates both challenges and opportunities, helps you make better decisions about your own financial security. Financial prudence is another area where individual action can make a real difference, but it needs to be approached differently than in the past. The old model was simple: work hard, save money, put it in safe investments, and let compound interest do the work. That approach served previous generations well because they lived in an era of relatively stable prices and predictable returns. But when inflation is eroding the value of cash, savings and traditional safe investments are paying less than the rate of price increases, you need a more sophisticated approach. This doesn't mean taking crazy risks or chasing get-rich-quick schemes. It means diversifying in ways that protect against different kinds of economic disruption. Some money in assets that tend to hold their value during inflation, some in investments that benefit from technological innovation, some in resources that remain valuable regardless of what happens to paper currencies. And it means being more thoughtful about spending patterns. Not miserly or fearful, but strategic. Investing in things that improve your long-term health and independence. Reducing dependence on systems that might become unreliable. Building relationships and skills that create security beyond just financial wealth. Health, by the way, deserves special attention because it's both a personal asset and a hedge against economic uncertainty. In a world where healthcare costs are rising faster than income, and where economic disruption might affect access to services, your physical and mental well-being becomes even more valuable. This isn't just about taking your medications and seeing your doctor regularly, though those things matter. It's about thinking systematically about what keeps you strong, independent, and resilient. Exercise that maintains your mobility, social connections that support your mental health, intellectual engagement that keeps your mind sharp, practical skills that reduce your dependence on services that might become expensive or unreliable. But individual preparation, important as it is, only goes so far. The bigger opportunities come from community-level responses. One of the most interesting things I've observed is how economic disruption often strengthens local communities, even as it weakens larger institutions. When people can't rely on distant corporations or government programs to meet their needs, they rediscover the value of neighbors, local businesses, and community organizations. During the pandemic, we saw this everywhere. Neighborhood groups organizing grocery deliveries for seniors, local restaurants pivoting to serve their communities in new ways, people discovering that their next-door neighbors had skills and resources they never knew about. This kind of local resilience becomes even more important when larger economic systems are unstable. And it's an area where seniors have particular advantages. You have experience, skills, and often time that younger people lack. You understand how communities used to work before everything became centralized and digitized. You have networks of relationships built over decades. There is enormous potential in intergenerational cooperation, seniors sharing knowledge and wisdom, younger people contributing energy and technical skills, middle-aged people providing leadership and resources. But these connections don't happen automatically. They require intentional effort to build bridges across age groups and create structures that benefit everyone. I think about successful examples I've seen. Community gardens, where seniors teach traditional growing techniques while younger people contribute knowledge about sustainable practices. Tool libraries where neighbors share equipment instead of everyone buying their own. Skill-sharing networks where people trade services based on what they know how to do rather than what they can afford to pay for. These might seem like small things, but They're actually profound responses to economic disruption. They create value outside the traditional monetary system. They build relationships that provide security beyond what any individual savings account can offer. And they demonstrate that human ingenuity can solve problems that seem overwhelming when you're facing them alone. At a larger scale, there's reason to believe that the same forces creating disruption might also drive innovation-led recovery. History shows that periods of economic crisis often coincide with breakthrough innovations. The technologies that powered the post-war boom, computers, jet engines, nuclear power, plastics, were largely developed during the economic hardships of the 1930 seconds and 1940 seconds. The Internet, which transformed the economy starting in the 1990 seconds, was created during the stagflation of the 1970 seconds. Today's challenges are driving similar innovation. Artificial intelligence and automation might eliminate some jobs, but they're also creating possibilities we can barely imagine. Clean energy technologies promise to reduce costs and increase energy independence. Medical advances could dramatically extend healthy lifespan and reduce healthcare costs. New materials and manufacturing techniques could make many products cheaper and more accessible. The question isn't whether these innovations will emerge. They're already emerging. The question is how quickly they'll scale up and how broadly their benefits will be distributed. Which brings us to the final and most important point. While we cannot stop what's coming, we can choose how we meet it. I want to be clear about something. I'm not suggesting that what's ahead will be easy, or that positive thinking alone will solve complex economic problems. Real disruption causes real hardship for real people. And some of the changes we're seeing will create genuine losses that can't be simply wished away or adapted to. But I am suggesting that how we frame what's happening affects how we respond to it, and how we respond affects what happens next. If we think of what's coming as simply a worse version of past recessions, we'll spend our energy trying to get back to where we were. We'll wait for someone else, politicians, central bankers, business leaders, to restore the old normal. And we'll be disappointed when that doesn't happen, because the old normal was built on conditions that no longer exist. If instead we think of what's happening as a transition to something different, we can focus our energy on understanding what that something might look like and how to position ourselves advantageously within it. This isn't naive optimism, it's strategic realism. The world is changing whether we like it or not. The question is whether we change with it in ways that serve our values and protect what matters most to us. For seniors especially, this perspective matters because you have something younger people don't have: perspective itself. You've lived through multiple cycles of change. You've seen predictions of doom that didn't materialize and promises. You also have something else that's valuable in times of uncertainty, less to lose from trying new approaches. If you're already retired, you don't have to worry about career advancement or professional reputation in the traditional sense. You can experiment a little. That freedom can be enormously valuable, both for your own adaptation and as an example for others. The young Clark I mentioned earlier, the one who witnessed Nixon's announcement in 1971, went on to become one of the world's most successful investors. Not because he predicted what would happen next, but because he learned to study historical patterns and position himself for multiple possible futures simultaneously. That's the approach that makes sense now. Not trying to predict exactly what will happen, but building resilience and maintaining adaptability so you can respond effectively to whatever does happen. And that's why conversations like this matter. Because awareness is the first step to resilience. What's coming may be much worse than a recession, but it doesn't have to break us. If we understand the forces at play, stay adaptable, and make choices with clarity, we can not only endure, but build something stronger for the next generation. The debt cycles will eventually reset, but that creates opportunities for those who understand how the reset works. Inflation will eventually stabilize, but in the meantime, we can learn to protect ourselves and even benefit from the transition. Geopolitical changes will create new winners and losers, but being aware of the trends helps us position ourselves wisely. Technology will continue to disrupt traditional ways of doing things, but it will also create tools and possibilities that can improve our lives. Most importantly, the human capacity for adaptation, innovation, and mutual support remains as strong as it's ever been. Every previous generation has faced changes that seemed overwhelming at the time, but ultimately proved manageable. We have advantages they didn't have: better communication, more information, longer lifespans, more accumulated wealth and knowledge. What we need now is the wisdom to use those advantages thoughtfully, the courage to face uncertainty without denial, and the patience to build solutions that will serve not just ourselves, but the generations that follow us. If this conversation gave you new perspective, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What changes do you see coming? Leave a comment below, share this with someone who might need to hear it, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss the next discussion. Because the more prepared we are together, the better chance we all have of facing the future with confidence.